I'm thinking about the task of writing a sermon. After 20 years of doing so, I've come to feel like writing a sermon is a lot like having a child. Kind of a nice theme for Mother's Day. You see, when you can get pregnant with an idea, and you can feed that idea with, multivitamins with the right amount of iron. Or if you're unlucky, you can take that little shake thing and find out that your glucose is off, and you can end up doing the maternal diabetic thing. But the whole way along, you're walking through this task of what do we want to put in to the birth of our child, right? And then birth happens. That's messy. For us, and the first time, it was messy within 7 minutes of being hooked up to the machines, and Warren's heart rate was slowing down with every contraction, and 13 hours and then a surgery later, it was like we forgot all the messy. But that really just starts the whole thing, right? Like that's just the beginning of putting things into your child. Watering and feeding, apparently, cotton candy and raspberries. And then there's this point in the journey, or really there's probably multiple points in the journey, where you've done everything you get to do. And it goes to have a life of its own. And all bets are off. Right? It's a beautiful thing. And I feel like sermon writing becomes like that. It's like having a child every week of your life for 40 years. You get an idea, something grabs you, you read, you watch, you exist in the world, you feed that idea, you let it percolate, and then it is born, and the Spirit is going to do with it what it will. My preaching professor, Mike, I call him Mike now, not then. He told us about a time when he preached a sermon. Today in the liturgical calendar, by the way, it's Trinity Sunday, but I don't really like Trinity Sunday, so forget that you know that. But he was preaching a sermon on the Trinity, and then, as one does, the preacher sits in the back after worship, and everybody was walking down the aisle to say things, and someone came to him and said, I just have to tell you, the illustration you used about the tricycle in that sermon was so profound. The problem is, he didn't talk about a tricycle. Nowhere in the sermon did he use the words tricycle, bicycle, wheel, anything like unto a tricycle. In fact, if he were to get down to it, he'd say, that's a pretty heretical notion of the Trinity. So I was never going to do that. However, that's a little bit what writing a sermon or having a child is like. There's all the things we can do, and there's all the things we cannot. And at a certain point, it's what fruit is made of these efforts. Thinking about that with these texts, especially the Jesus prayer, because this Jesus prayer moment reminds me a lot of Deuteronomy. What do I usually tell you about the book of Deuteronomy? Does anyone know? Do you remember? Somebody listens to my sermons. No, I know that you do. That it's like when Moses is taking his kid to college and it's a giant 31-some chapter speech to say, I'm really worried you're going to mess up the moment I turn my car around and head back home, right? And so he preaches at them to sum up everything he's been talking about for the 40 years they wandered in the wilderness, because 40 years ago when he took his college student to preschool, they did mess up and they got kicked out and sent home, right? Jesus' prayer here in the final discourse is a little bit that prayer, but it's not so much like Moses to the kids, but it's to God to say, God, I've done what I was sent to do here. And I hope now you will protect these, my students, nay, my friends, because what I've taught them to do is hard. Life is hard. And I love them. And I want them to flourish. But what happens next is out of my control. I like this idea of thinking about what is it that our lives is birthing in the world? What is the fruit our lives is producing? And at the root of that, that's funny to me, only to me apparently, is what are we watered by? What is the water that we're taking in? You are what you eat. And whether it's the psalmist in Psalm 1 or Jesus with his disciples, they are greatly concerned because there are a lot of wells in the world by which you could be watered. And a lot of them do not produce great fruit. The temptations, the clamoring after our attention. I don't know about you, but just the number of things now that text me to get my attention, which is now, thanks to youth group on Wednesday, inclusive of Stella's ice cream. And I don't mind being watered by Stella's ice cream. But it doesn't make a healthy Andrew if that's my primary rootedness. What are you watered by? What truth do you dig in on? There's nothing like spring soccer in Idaho. And I can remember a spring soccer game with Warren at Simplot, and that wind is coming down off Bogus Basin at something akin to 300 miles an hour and something akin to negative 60 degrees. And it's whipping down. But the visual that I can remember the most, I can picture this one game in which Tumbleweed scored 12 goals. But the kids sitting like this, and because my wife is pretty awesome, like half the team is wearing gloves that we brought, because my wife is the best scout ever, and she doesn't go anywhere without 12 hats and 12 gloves and 12 of everything, and then we parcel it out to the whole team. She is well watered. And but we're in this game, and these kids can't score anything because they're miserable. I don't even know what we're doing out there. But the tumbleweed being blown by that wind down off Bogus Basin is flying in the goals left and right. Right? And the scriptural text asks us, are we tumbleweed? Are we that which is chasing after everything, clamoring for our attention? Are we living at the whim of the world? Or are we like trees planted next to the stream, deeply rooted? And the wind doesn't always like the tree, it can't move, just as the world doesn't always like those who refuse to play its games. This last week, I was in Dallas, Texas. I've only ever spent time in Dallas at the airport. In fact, I remember a week we spent there one afternoon, going around on that tram with a young Warren, because we had like a 4-hour layover and a 3-year-old kid. So what do? You put them in the front of that tram, which just goes in a circle, and you ride it around and around and around. I spent a week there once, one afternoon. But this is my first time to actual Dallas, and while we were there, we had these different opportunities. My clergy group tries to understand a little bit of the heart of the city that we're in and the ministries of the church that's in that city. And we got a chance to sit with two of the former mayors, and we were talking about, and I blanked on the name, a Dallasite author who wrote a book reflecting on Kennedy's assassination. As you may recall, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. We got to look at the window and the knoll, and then someone said, oh, so this is where the CIA staged the fake assassination. That's not the message you should come away with. That's what you're going to remember. That's the tricycle of my sermon, right? Anyway, in that book, the author said, if Kennedy was fated to die, I'm glad it happened in Dallas. And we asked these mayors to reflect on that because for Dallas, it was an event of deep shame. Newspaper articles ran on headlines that the hatred in Dallas killed Kennedy, in much the way that you might see if, say, Obama had been assassinated visiting Idaho. You can imagine the headlines. And Dallas had to look in the mirror and ask itself, is this the kind of city we are? Is this the kind of city we want to be? And if not, what kind of city do we want to be? They were asking Psalm 1 questions, weren't they? By what are we watered? What fruit are we producing? And if we don't like what we're seeing right now in the mirror, how do we root ourselves differently? And so that author and the reflections of these mayors and others, not everyone, but a lot of Dallasites, is that Dallas is today a much better and healthier place for the questions it had to ask itself in the wake of Kennedy's assassination. And I love thinking about that for our own lives. I think that's what Jesus means when Jesus says, they are not of the world, but they will live in the world. They are of God. We are of God. When people see and judge our fruits for the values we're living, they should not see us as any other thing than that which is deeply rooted in the divine love of the God who formed us while we were in our mother's womb. But is that what they see? Is that who we are? And if not, what do we intend to do about it? This is what Jesus yearns for us to be at work with. This is what the psalmist yearns for us to understand. Because the psalmist says, when you are deeply rooted in the divine, the world may not love you, but it can't touch your joy. Because you will know that you are what the one who made you wished you to be. And that will be all that matters. By what are you watered? This is the word of our Lord.